The spring flood came 3 days after Matthew Reed buried his father, as if the heavens themselves were weeping with relentless fury for old Samuel Reed's passing. Matthew stood on the muddy bank, his weathered hat clutched in calloused hands, watching helplessly as the swollen river tore at the fence line his father had built 20 years prior. The boundary marker that had stood for a generation was now surrendering to nature's wrath, post by post, rail by rail. "Ain't no use standing there like a statue, cowboy," came a voice from behind him. Matthew turned to find Hannah Evans watching him from atop her dappled mare. The schoolteacher was a recent arrival to Cottonwood Springs, having taken over the one-room schoolhouse just 6 months prior. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and despite the early hour and dismal weather, she looked remarkably put together. "Miss Evans," he acknowledged with a tip of his chin. "Bit early for you to be out riding." "School's closed on account of the flooding," she replied, dismounting with practiced ease. Her riding skirt was splattered with mud, but she paid it no mind as she came to stand beside him. "I wanted to see how bad it was downstream." Together they watched as another section of fence surrendered to the churning waters. "Your father built that fence, didn't he?" she asked softly. Matthew nodded, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. "Every post, every rail." Hannah stepped closer, her shoulder nearly touching his. "It can take the wood, Matthew," she said gently, "not the memory." He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing something in her green eyes that he hadn't noticed before, understanding, compassion. Something that made his heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with grief. It was the spring of 1874, and as the water rose around them, something else was beginning to rise in Matthew Reed's heart, something he'd never expected to find in the aftermath of loss. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said finally, placing his hat back on his head. "The creek crossings will be dangerous. Let me ride back with you to town." Hannah smiled, a small, gentle thing. "I'd appreciate the company." Matthew whistled for his horse, the sturdy buckskin gelding trotting obediently from where he'd been grazing on higher ground. As they mounted up, Matthew took one last look at the disintegrating fence line. "Sometimes," Hannah said, following his gaze, "we have to let go of what was to make room for what might be." Matthew nodded slowly, turning his horse toward town. "My pa always said a man measures his worth by what he builds and what he leaves behind." "Your father was right," Hannah replied. "But I suspect he meant more than just fences." They rode side by side through the rain-soaked landscape, neither aware that their chance meeting by the flooded riverbank was the beginning of a story that would become its own kind of legacy in Cottonwood Springs. The main street of Cottonwood Springs was a river of mud. Horses and wagons had churned what had once been hard, packed earth into a treacherous slop that threatened to suck the boots right off a man's feet. Matthew and Hannah picked their way carefully down the thoroughfare, their horses snorting in displeasure at the conditions. "Looks like everybody's at Thornton's," Matthew observed, nodding toward the general store where a crowd had gathered on the covered porch. "Probably discussing the damage," Hannah replied. "I heard the Morrison place got hit bad, their barns completely gone." Matthew frowned. The Morrisons had 3 young children and a new baby. Losing their barn and likely their livestock would be devastating. "I'll head over there tomorrow, see what help they need." Hannah glanced at him with approval. "That's kind of you," he shrugged uncomfortably. "It's what neighbors do." They reached the small clapboard building that served as both schoolhouse and Hannah's living quarters. Matthew dismounted first, then moved to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her effortlessly from the saddle. For a moment, they stood close, too close for propriety, before Matthew stepped back, clearing his throat. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Reed," Hannah said formally, though her eyes held a warmth that belied her proper tone. "Matthew," he corrected. "After watching a river take my fence together, I reckon we can use first names, Miss Evans." "Hannah, then," she replied with a small smile. "Hannah," he repeated, and something about the way her name felt in his mouth made his heart beat a little faster. "Will you be all right here? The creek behind the schoolhouse could rise." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "The schoolhouse sits on the highest ground in town." Old Mayor Whitley made sure of that when it was built. Matthew nodded but didn't move to leave. I could check on you tomorrow, he offered, then quickly added, to make sure the building's holding up. Hannah's lips curved upward. I'd like that. With a tip of his hat, Matthew mounted his buckskin and turned toward home, what was left of it anyway. The Reed Ranch had been his father's pride, but now it sat empty save for Matthew and the memories that haunted every corner. As he rode, the rain finally began to taper off, though the gray skies promised more to come. The road to the ranch followed the river for nearly 2 miles before cutting inland toward the rolling hills where the Reed cattle grazed. Matthew couldn't help but track the damage as he rode. More fencing gone, a small shed washed away, fields that would be unusable for weeks until the water receded. The ranch house came into view as he crested the final hill, a sturdy 2-story structure his father had expanded 3 times over the years. The barn and outbuildings stood intact, though water pooled in the yard and around the foundations. Matthew was relieved to see the cattle had instinctively moved to higher ground. He unsaddled and rubbed down his horse before heading into the silent house. It had been 3 months since his mother passed from pneumonia, 6 days since his father's heart had given out while mending tack in the barn. Now it was just Matthew, at 28 suddenly the owner of 300 acres, 75 head of cattle, and a house full of ghosts. After changing into dry clothes, Matthew built a fire in the stone hearth and settled into his father's chair with a tin cup of whiskey. As the flames cast dancing shadows across the room, his thoughts drifted back to Hannah Evans standing by the river, her quiet words of comfort cutting through his grief like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds. "It can take the wood, not the memory," he murmured to himself, turning the phrase over in his mind. There was wisdom there, wisdom he sorely needed as he faced a future very different from the one he'd imagined. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Matthew rose early, as was his habit, and set about assessing the damage in the full light of day. The river had begun to recede, revealing the extent of its thievery. Nearly a quarter-mile of fence gone, a small storage shed washed away, and fields of spring grass now buried under silt and debris. After tending to the immediate needs of the livestock, Matthew saddled his buckskin and rode toward the Morrison homestead. As expected, the damage there was extensive. The barn had indeed been swept away, along with 2 milk cows and a prized plow horse. Robert Morrison stood in what had been his farmyard, shoulders slumped in defeat. "Robert," Matthew called as he approached. Morrison looked up, his face gray with exhaustion. "Matthew, heard about your pa. I'm right sorry." "Appreciate that," Matthew replied, dismounting. "Came to see what you need." Morrison shook his head. "Don't know where to start, truth be told." "Start with shelter for what livestock you got left," Matthew said practically. "I brought some rope and tools. We can rig something temporary until we can organize a barn raising." For the next several hours, the men worked side by side, salvaging what materials they could and constructing a makeshift shelter. Around midday, other neighbors arrived, the Taylors from the North Valley, Old Man Jenkins and his sons. Even Sheriff Hollister pitched in for an hour between rounds. This was the way of things in Cottonwood Springs. People looked after their own, especially when disaster struck. By late afternoon, the Morrisons had a temporary barn, promises of replacement livestock, and enough supplies to see them through the next few weeks. As Matthew prepared to leave, Mrs. Morrison pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into his hands. "It's not enough for all you've done, but it's what I can offer," she said, her eyes bright with gratitude. "No need for payment among neighbors," Matthew replied, though he accepted the bread with thanks. He rode back toward town, intending to make good on his promise to check on Hannah. The schoolhouse was quiet when he arrived, but smoke rose from the chimney. Matthew tethered his horse and knocked on the door. Hannah opened it, surprise registering on her face before it softened into a welcome smile. "Matthew, I wasn't sure you'd come." "Said I would," he replied simply. She stepped back, inviting him in. "I've just made coffee. Would you like some?" The schoolroom was tidy and warm, children's slates stacked neatly on a shelf, lessons written on the large blackboard in Hannah's precise handwriting. A small door at the back led to her private quarters. "How bad is it?" she asked, pouring coffee into two mismatched cups. "Morrison's lost their barn and some stock. The creek took out the bridge to the North Valley. My fence is gone for a quarter-mile at least." He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Could have been worse." "I heard you organized help for the Morrisons," Hannah said, sitting at one of the student desks. "That was good of you." Matthew shifted uncomfortably under her praise. "Like I said, it's what neighbors do." "Not all neighbors," Hannah countered. "Some would look to their own troubles first." "My troubles will keep," Matthew said, then added more quietly, "It helps to have something useful to do." Hannah studied him over the rim of her cup. "Because of your father," Matthew nodded, surprised at how easily she had read him. "The ranch feels empty now." "I understand," she said softly. "When my parents died, our family home felt like a mausoleum. That's partly why I took the teaching position here to start fresh somewhere new." "Both your parents are gone?" Matthew asked, realizing how little he knew about her. "Yes. Influenza took them both 3 years ago within days of each other." Her voice held the same quieted grief he felt in his own heart. "My older brother Henry runs the family farm now, back in Illinois. You came a long way. I needed the distance," she admitted. "Sometimes memories need room to settle into something you can carry without breaking under the weight." Her words struck Matthew deeply. That was exactly what he was struggling with, how to carry the memory of his parents, their expectations, the legacy of the ranch, without being crushed by it all. "Is that why you said what you did? About the fence and memories?" Hannah smiled softly. "Perhaps. It's something my mother used to say, though she was talking about a quilt that got ruined in a roof leak. They can take the quilt, Hannah, but not the memory of the hands that made it." "Your mother sounds like she was wise." "She was," Hannah agreed, "though I didn't always appreciate it at the time." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, finishing their coffee. Matthew found himself studying Hannah's face, the slight scatter of freckles across her nose, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the strand of honey-brown hair that had escaped her practical bun. "I should go," he said finally, standing. "Got cattle to check before dark." "Of course." Hannah walked him to the door. "Thank you for stopping by. It was nice to have the company." "Town meeting tomorrow at Thornton's," Matthew said, "to organize repairs for the bridge and other damage. Will you be there?" "I will," she confirmed. "The children have been asking if school will resume soon." "What will you tell them?" "That knowledge doesn't wait for good weather," she replied with a small smile. "We'll resume on Monday, even if I have to hold class on the porch." Matthew found himself smiling back, the first genuine smile since his father's passing. "Determined, aren't you?" "I've been called stubborn," Hannah admitted, "but I prefer resolute." "Resolute," Matthew repeated. "It suits you." With a tip of his hat, he stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, carrying with him the warmth of Hannah's smile and the curious lightness in his chest that her company had inspired. The town meeting at Thornton's store the following day drew nearly every resident of Cottonwood Springs. Matthew arrived early to find the place already buzzing with conversation. Mayor Whitley, a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers, was holding court near the potbelly stove, while groups of ranchers and townspeople clustered throughout the store. "Read." "Over here," called Jasper Hollister, the town sheriff and one of Matthew's oldest friends. Matthew made his way through the crowd to where Jasper stood with Doc Wilson and Harvey Thornton, the store's proprietor. "Just telling these fellas about the state of the North Bridge," Jasper said. "It's worse than we thought. Support beams are completely washed out." "That cuts off nearly a third of the valley," Matthew observed. "The Taylors, Jenkins, Old Widow Harmon, they all use that route to reach town." "Not to mention the stage route," added Harvey Thornton, always mindful of business. "If the stage can't get through, we don't get supplies or mail, or my medical shipments," Doc Wilson put in gravely. "I'm running low on several necessities." "What about the South Crossing?" Matthew asked. "Could we improve that while we rebuild the bridge?" "Might work as a temporary solution," Jasper conceded. but it would add nearly 10 miles to the journey for folks coming from the north. Their discussion was interrupted as Hannah entered the store, accompanied by Mrs. Thornton. Matthew felt a strange flutter in his chest as their eyes met across the room. She offered a small smile before turning her attention to Mayor Whitley, who had begun calling for order. Folks. Let's get started here, the mayor announced, climbing onto an empty barrel to better address the crowd. We all know why we're gathered. The flood's done considerable damage to our community, and it's going to take a coordinated effort to set things right. For the next hour, the mayor led a discussion of priorities: the North Bridge, damaged homes, lost livestock, and ruined crops. Committees were formed for various tasks, and materials were pledged from those who had resources to spare. The schoolhouse will serve as a collection point for food and clothing donations, Hannah offered when called upon, and I can coordinate volunteers for the cooking rotation for work crews. Much appreciated, Miss Evans, Mayor Whitley nodded. Now, regarding the bridge, we need someone to head up that reconstruction. It's our most pressing concern. A moment of silence fell over the gathering. Bridge building was specialized work, requiring both skill and experience. My father rebuilt that bridge after the '65 flood, Matthew found himself saying. I still have his plans and notes. I can lead the effort. All eyes turned to him, and Matthew felt a momentary panic at what he'd just volunteered for. But then he caught Hannah watching him, a look of quiet confidence in her eyes, and he straightened his shoulders. Good man, Reed, Mayor Whitley approved. Who'll join his crew? Hands went up around the room: the Jenkins boys, Taylor and his 2 grown sons. Jasper offered to help when his duties allowed, and several others stepped forward. Within minutes, Matthew found himself the leader of a 12-man bridge crew with promises of materials and support from the town council. As the meeting broke into smaller discussions, Hannah made her way to Matthew's side. That was a generous offer, she said. Taking on the bridge reconstruction. Might have spoken without thinking it through, Matthew admitted, but it needs doing. Do you really have your father's plans? Matthew nodded. Pa kept detailed records of everything he built. Said a man should document his work so others could learn from it. He sounds like he was an excellent teacher, Hannah observed. Never thought of it that way, but I suppose he was, Matthew replied, considering. Taught me everything I know about ranching, building, being a man. Then his lessons live on through you, she said simply. Another memory the river couldn't take. Before Matthew could respond, Mayor Whitley called Hannah away to discuss something with the other committee heads. Matthew watched her go, struck again by her quiet wisdom and the way she seemed to see right through to the heart of things. She's a fine woman, came a voice at his elbow. Matthew turned to find Doc Wilson observing him with knowing eyes. The teacher. Yes, she seems capable enough, Matthew replied carefully. Doc's white eyebrows rose skeptically. Capable indeed, and pretty as a spring morning, though I suspect you've noticed that as well. Matthew felt heat rise in his face. Doc, I don't save it, son, the older man interrupted with a chuckle. I've been doctoring in this town since before you were born. I know the look of a man whose heart is starting to heal and open to new possibilities. It's been less than a week since I buried my father, Matthew protested. And grief will take its time, as it should, Doc acknowledged. But life has a way of moving forward, whether we're ready or not. Rather like that river of yours, it flows on, carving new paths when old ones are blocked. With a pat on Matthew's shoulder, the doctor moved away, leaving Matthew to ponder his words. Was his heart truly opening to new possibilities? It seemed impossible so soon after loss, and yet when he looked at Hannah Evans, something stirred in him that felt remarkably like hope. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Matthew divided his time between tending to his ranch and leading the bridge reconstruction effort. The work was demanding but satisfying, and he found comfort in the physical labor and camaraderie of the crew. His father's detailed plans proved invaluable, earning him respect from even the most experienced builders among them. Hannah, true to her word, reopened the school while also coordinating relief efforts for those hardest hit by the flooding. Several evenings a week, She and a rotation of town women provided hot meals for the bridge workers. Matthew found himself looking forward to these meals not for the food, though it was certainly welcome, but for the chance to exchange a few words with Hannah. Their conversations were necessarily brief, given the public setting and their respective duties, but each interaction seemed to strengthen the connection between them. Matthew learned that Hannah had studied at a women's college in Boston before returning to her family's farm in Illinois. She was well-read, with a particular fondness for poetry, and had a gift for explaining complex ideas in simple terms, a talent that made her an excellent teacher. For her part, Hannah discovered that, beneath Matthew's quiet, sometimes gruff exterior lay a thoughtful man with a dry sense of humor and a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility. She admired his unwavering dedication to rebuilding not just the bridge but the community's spirit. On a warm Saturday nearly 3 weeks after the flood, Matthew finished his ranch chores early and rode into town. The bridge was progressing well, the main support beams were in place, and the crew had begun laying the decking. Another week of good weather, and it would be passable for riders, if not yet wagons. Without any specific plan in mind, Matthew found himself approaching the schoolhouse. It was the weekend, but he'd noticed that Hannah often spent Saturdays preparing lessons or tending to the small garden behind the building. The thought of seeing her outside the busy context of bridge work or town meetings made his pulse quicken. He knocked on the schoolhouse door, removing his hat as he waited. When no answer came, he walked around to the back, where he found Hannah kneeling in the garden, a basket of freshly pulled carrots beside her. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the sun. "Matthew," she greeted him with evident pleasure. "This is a surprise. Finished up early at the ranch," he explained, suddenly feeling awkward. "Thought I'd check on the bridge, then remembered you mentioned having trouble with your garden fence." In truth, she had mentioned it in passing nearly a week ago, and Matthew had stored the information away, looking for an excuse to offer assistance. Hannah smiled, seeing through his pretext but appreciating it nonetheless. "That's very thoughtful. The rabbits have been having quite a feast at my expense." She stood, brushing soil from her skirt, and led him to the simple picket fence that enclosed her small vegetable patch. Several pickets were indeed loose or broken, creating easy access for hungry wildlife. "Shouldn't take long to fix," Matthew assessed. "I've got some tools in my saddlebag. Do you have spare pickets?" "Behind the woodshed," Hannah directed. "Mr. Jenkins left them when he built the fence last fall." As Matthew set to work, Hannah returned to harvesting vegetables, and they fell into an easy conversation that flowed from topic to topic: the progress on the bridge, her student's latest achievements, the condition of his cattle after the flood. "How are you managing the ranch on your own?" Hannah asked as she pulled the last of the carrots. "It must be a tremendous amount of work." Matthew drove in another nail before answering. "It is, but I've hired young Timmy Jenkins to help with the daily chores while I'm working on the bridge. He's a good worker." "And after the bridge is finished," Matthew paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Been thinking on that, might need to take on a permanent hand. Pa and I managed well enough together, but alone," he shrugged. "Ranch that size needs more than one pair of hands. Have you considered selling?" Hannah asked carefully, aware it might be a sensitive subject. "Every day," Matthew admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "And then every night I tell myself I can't sell what my father built, what he meant for me to have." Hannah set her basket aside and moved closer. "What do you think he would want for you, Matthew? The ranch or happiness?" The question struck him deeply. "Never thought of it as a choice between the two." "Perhaps it isn't," Hannah conceded. "But if it were, what would Samuel Reed choose for his son?" Matthew drove in the final nail with more force than necessary, buying time to consider her question. "He'd want me to be happy," he said finally, "but he'd also expect me to honor my responsibilities. And if you found a way to do both," Matthew turned to face her fully. "What are you suggesting, Miss Evans?" Hannah met his gaze steadily. "Nothing specific, Mr. Reed, just that there might be solutions you haven't yet considered." There was something in her expression, a warmth, an openness that made Matthew wonder if they were still talking about the ranch at all. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both turned to see Sheriff Hollister riding up, his expression urgent. "Matthew, thought I might find you here," Jasper called. "We've got trouble at the bridge. The South support is shifting. Jenkins thinks it could go if we don't shore it up right away." "I'll be right there," Matthew replied, quickly gathering his tools. He turned back to Hannah. "I need to go, of course," she said. "Thank you for fixing the fence." "My pleasure." He hesitated, then added, "Maybe we could continue our conversation another time. Perhaps supper at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening." Hannah's eyes widened slightly, but a pleased smile spread across her face. "I'd like that very much." With a nod and a tip of his hat, Matthew mounted his horse and followed Jasper toward the bridge, his mind already racing with engineering solutions, even as his heart lightened at the prospect of dinner with Hannah. The crisis at the bridge proved manageable, though it took Matthew and the crew until well after dark to properly shore up the shifting support. By the time he returned to the ranch, he was exhausted but satisfied with the day's work both at the bridge and at Hannah's garden. Sunday morning dawned clear and mild. After tending to the livestock, Matthew rode into town for the weekly church service, something he'd done irregularly since his father's passing. Today, however, he took extra care with his appearance, donning his good suit and polished boots. The small white clapboard church was nearly full when he arrived. Matthew slipped into a back pew, nodding greetings to neighbors and friends. He spotted Hannah near the front, sitting with Mrs. Thornton and her daughters. As if sensing his gaze, she turned slightly, scanning the congregation until she found him. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a small smile before turning her attention back to Reverend Powell as he began the service. The Reverend's sermon that day focused on renewal and rebuilding, apt themes for a community recovering from natural disaster. He spoke of Noah after the flood, tasked with beginning again in a world washed clean, and of the promise represented by the rainbow. Matthew found himself more engaged than usual, the words resonating with his own situation. After the service, the congregation gathered outside for their usual socializing. Matthew hung back, exchanging pleasantries with several ranchers while keeping an eye out for Hannah. When she finally emerged, deep in conversation with the Reverend's wife, he made his way toward her with determined steps. "Miss Evans," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "Good morning." "Mr. Reed," she returned with a warm smile. "I trust the bridge emergency was resolved successfully." "It was, thank you. We should be back on schedule." He cleared his throat slightly. "I wanted to confirm our dinner engagement this evening, 6 o'clock at the hotel restaurant, if that suits you." Hannah's cheeks colored slightly at his formal tone, but her eyes danced with pleasure. 6 o'clock would be perfect, thank you, Mrs. Powell, observing their exchange with obvious interest, excused herself to join her husband, leaving Matthew and Hannah momentarily alone despite the crowd around them. "How is your garden fence holding up?" Matthew asked, searching for a neutral topic. "Admirably well," Hannah replied. "Not a single rabbit invasion last night. Glad to hear it." He hesitated, then added, "I enjoyed our conversation yesterday." "As did I," Hannah said softly. "Perhaps we can continue it this evening without further emergencies interrupting." "I'd like that," Matthew agreed, just as Mayor Whitley approached, eager to discuss bridge progress. With a regretful smile, Hannah excused herself, joining a group of her students and their parents. Matthew watched her go, a curious lightness in his chest, despite the mayor's droning questions about timber supplies and support beams. The afternoon passed slowly for Matthew as he attended to necessary ranch chores while his mind continually drifted to the evening ahead. At 5:30, freshly bathed and dressed in his best suit, he rode into town. He debated bringing flowers but had ultimately decided against it, too forward, perhaps, for what was, ostensibly, just a friendly dinner. The Grand Hotel restaurant was Cottonwood Springs' finest dining establishment, which wasn't saying much by big city standards, but represented the height of local sophistication. White tablecloths, proper silverware, and a menu that extended beyond the standard fare of the saloon made it the preferred location for special occasions. Hannah was already waiting in the small lobby when Matthew arrived, a vision in a dress of deep blue that complemented her eyes and honey-brown hair, which she'd styled in an elegant arrangement of curls. "You look beautiful," Matthew said simply, the words escaping before he could consider their propriety. Hannah's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself." The maitre d', who was also the hotel owner, Mr. Graves, led them to a table by the window overlooking the town square. After ordering, they fell into conversation that flowed as naturally as it had in Hannah's garden, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen, and childhood memories. "So you never wanted to be a rancher?" Hannah asked as they enjoyed their meal. Matthew considered the question. "Never thought about wanting to be anything else. It was always assumed I'd take over the Reed Ranch someday. It's what my father wanted, what he worked for." "And what do you want, Matthew?" Hannah asked, her expression gentle but serious. "I want," he paused, realizing he'd never truly asked himself that question. "I want to honor my father's legacy, but I'm starting to think that might mean more than just maintaining what he built. It might mean building something of my own, too." Hannah nodded encouragingly. "What would that look like?" Matthew shared his ideas, expanding the cattle operation, but also diversifying into horses, perhaps, building new, modern structures on the ranch. Maybe even eventually having a family to share it with. As he spoke, he realized he was describing not just plans for the ranch, but dreams for a future that, until recently, he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. "What about you?" he asked finally. "Is teaching in Cottonwood Springs what you dreamed of doing?" "I always wanted to teach," Hannah replied, "though I imagined doing so closer to home initially, but after my parents died." She paused, twisting her napkin slightly. "As I told you, I needed distance from the memories. The position here offered that, along with independence." "Do you think you'll stay?" Matthew asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Hannah met his eyes steadily. "I'm finding reasons to consider it more seriously than I once did." The intensity of her gaze made his heart race. "I'm glad to hear that," he said softly. Their dinner concluded with apple pie and coffee, the conversation turning to lighter topics: the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, Mrs. Thornton's infamous rivalry with Mrs. Jenkins over whose preserves would win the county fair, the antics of Hannah's youngest students. When the evening finally drew to a close, Matthew escorted Hannah back to the schoolhouse. They walked slowly in the moonlight, neither seeming eager to end their time together. At her door, Hannah turned to face him. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Matthew." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." "I'd like that very much." Matthew hesitated, then, gathering his courage, he leaned down and gently kissed her cheek. "Good night, Hannah." Her hand rose to touch the spot where his lips had been, her eyes wide and luminous in the moonlight. "Good night, Matthew." As he rode back to the ranch that night, Matthew felt as if something fundamental had shifted within him. The weight of grief that had pressed on him since his father's death hadn't disappeared, but alongside it now bloomed something new: hope, possibility, the beginning of joy. The following weeks saw a transformation in both the town and in Matthew and Hannah's relationship. The bridge reconstruction progressed steadily, and by mid-May, it was open to both riders and light wagons. The fields were drying, new crops were planted, and Cottonwood Springs began to recover from the flood's devastation. Matthew and Hannah continued to see each other regularly. What began as dinner at the hotel became a steady courtship: Sunday afternoon rides, picnic lunches by the now calm river, evenings spent on the schoolhouse porch talking until the stars came out. Matthew even attended the school's spring recital, sitting proudly in the audience as Hannah's students demonstrated their learning. They were careful, at first, to maintain propriety, mindful of the town's watchful eyes and Hannah's position as the schoolteacher. But as spring deepened into summer, their growing attachment became common knowledge in Cottonwood Springs, generally met with approval and the occasional knowing smile. For Matthew, the ranch no longer felt like a burden or an empty reminder of loss. With Hannah by his side, he began to see it through new eyes, not just as his father's legacy, but as the foundation for his own future. He hired a permanent ranch hand, freeing himself to make improvements and expand operations. He even began drawing up plans for an addition to the house, though he kept those to himself for the time being. Hannah, meanwhile, flourished both as a teacher and as a respected member of the community. Her students adored her, and parents praised her dedication and skill. She started a small lending library in a corner of the schoolhouse, stocking it with books ordered from back east with her own savings. The garden behind the schoolhouse expanded, with Matthew building a more substantial fence and adding raised beds for vegetables and flowers. It was there, in the garden they had cultivated together, that Matthew finally found the courage to speak what had been growing in his heart. A golden afternoon in late June found them harvesting the first strawberries of the season. Hannah knelt in the soil, carefully selecting the ripest berries, while Matthew worked nearby, repairing a trellis for the climbing beans. "Mrs. Powell asked me an interesting question after church yesterday," Hannah remarked, dropping another berry into her basket. "Oh." Matthew replied, hammering a nail into place. "What was that?" she asked when we were going to make things official. Hannah's tone was carefully casual, though her eyes, when they flicked to Matthew's face, held a certain watchfulness. Matthew paused, hammer in mid-swing. "Did she now?" Hannah affirmed, returning her attention to the strawberry plants. "Apparently, there's a wager going in town about whether you'll propose before or after the Founders' Day dance next month." Matthew set down his hammer, his heart suddenly pounding. "People are betting on us, so it seems." Hannah's cheeks were pink, and not just from the sun. Sheriff Hollister is reportedly favoring before, while Mayor Whitley is firmly in the after camp. Matthew moved to kneel beside her in the soft earth. "And what did you tell Mrs. Powell?" Hannah looked up at him then, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and hope. "I told her it wasn't up to me, that some questions can only be asked by one person and answered by another." Matthew took her hand, strawberry stains and all. "And if that question were asked today, here among the strawberries you planted and the fence I built, what might the answer be?" Hannah's free hand rose to touch his face, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The answer would be yes, Matthew Reed. It would most definitely be yes." With fingers that trembled slightly, Matthew reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, his mother's, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Hannah Evans," he said softly, "I came to you a broken man watching a river take away part of my past. You showed me that while water might take the wood, it can't take the memory or the future we might build together. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered as a tear spilled down her cheek. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and hope that had blossomed between them since that rainy day by the flooded river. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "Sheriff Hollister just won himself a tidy sum," he murmured. Hannah laughed, the sound bright and joyous in the sun-dappled garden. "We should tell him first then, as a reward for his faith in you." "In us," Matthew corrected, stealing another kiss. "His faith in us." They announced their engagement at church the following Sunday, to the surprise of no one and the delight of everyone except perhaps Mayor Whitley, who good-naturedly handed over his wager to a smug Sheriff Hollister. The wedding was set for September, after the harvest and before the first snows, a time of natural transition that seemed fitting for their new beginning. The summer passed in a whirlwind of activity. While Hannah continued teaching and planning for the fall term, Matthew threw himself into preparations for their shared future. The addition to the ranch house took shape: a spacious new kitchen, a proper dining room, and upstairs, a room that might one day become a nursery. Hannah visited the ranch regularly, offering suggestions for the renovations and bringing touches of her own personality to what would soon be her home. She loved the wide views from the front porch and the way sunset painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I can see why your father chose this land," she remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the day's light fade. "There's something almost sacred about it." Matthew nodded, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. He used to say he felt closer to God here than in any church. "I can understand that," Hannah agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I believe God is present in both in the sanctuary built by human hands and in the cathedral crafted by his own." Matthew smiled, still sometimes amazed by the depth and beauty of her thoughts. "You know, when that flood took my fence, I felt like it was washing away the last physical connection to my father. But you were right, the memory remains. And now I'm building new things, creating new memories." "We're building them together," Hannah corrected gently. "Just as we'll build our life together, one day at a time." As summer ripened toward autumn, Cottonwood Springs prepared for its annual Founders' Day celebration, scheduled for the first weekend in September. This year, the event took on special significance as a celebration of the town's recovery from the spring flood. There would be a parade, contests, a community supper, and, of course, the traditional dance in the town square. The day of the celebration dawned clear and bright, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Matthew spent the morning helping set up for the festivities, then returned to the ranch to change into his best clothes. When he rode back into town that afternoon, the streets were already filled with people, laughter, and music. He found Hannah surrounded by her students, supervising their contribution to the celebration, a display of essays and artwork depicting the town's history and recovery. She wore a new dress of deep green that complemented her eyes, and her hair was arranged in an elegant style he hadn't seen before. "You look beautiful," he said when he finally managed to steal a moment with her. "Thank you," she replied with a smile. "You're looking quite handsome yourself, Mr. Reed." They joined in the festivities, watching the horse races, applauding the prize-winning preserves, a tie between Mrs. Thornton and Mrs. Jenkins, to everyone's amusement, and sampling the abundant food at the community supper. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the town square and the musicians took their places on a small platform at one end. "May I have this dance, Miss Evans?" Matthew asked formally as the first waltz began. "You may indeed, Mr. Reed," Hannah replied, placing her hand in his. They moved gracefully among the other couples, their steps in perfect harmony despite having danced together only a handful of times before. Something about holding Hannah in his arms felt both exciting and utterly right, as if they had been meant to find each other all along. "2 weeks," Matthew murmured as they circled the floor, "2 weeks until you're Mrs. Reed." Hannah's eyes shone in the lantern light. "I can hardly wait." As the evening progressed, they danced again and again, stepping aside occasionally to chat with friends or rest briefly before returning to the floor. During one such break, Sheriff Hollister approached them, his expression unusually serious. "Matthew, Miss Evans," he greeted them. "Hate to interrupt your evening, but I've got some news you should hear." Something in his tone made Matthew tense. "What is it, Jasper?" "Got a telegram from the marshal in Silverton," Jasper explained. "There's been trouble at the Evans farm in Illinois. Your brother Henry was injured in a barn fire, Miss Evans. He's asking for you." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, her face draining of color. "Henry, how badly is he hurt?" Telegram didn't say, just that he's asking for you and that it's urgent. Matthew put his arm around Hannah's shoulders, steadying her. "When did this happen?" 3 days ago. Message has been relayed through several offices to reach us." Hannah looked up at Matthew, her eyes wide with worry. "I need to go to him. He's my only family." "Of course you do," Matthew agreed without hesitation. "When does the next eastbound train leave from Junction City?" "Tomorrow at noon," Jasper replied. "If you leave at dawn, you can make it." Hannah's fingers twisted the engagement ring on her left hand. "Our wedding." "We'll wait," Matthew finished firmly. "Family comes first. We'll reschedule when you return." The joy of the evening evaporated as they made hasty plans. Hannah would need to pack, arrange for a substitute teacher, and prepare for the journey. Matthew insisted on accompanying her at least as far as Junction City to see her safely onto the train. They left the dance early, and Matthew escorted Hannah back to the schoolhouse, where they found Mrs. Powell already waiting, having been informed of the situation by her husband. The older woman immediately offered to take over Hannah's classes and help pack for the journey. "I'll come for you at dawn," Matthew promised as he reluctantly prepared to leave her to her preparations. "Try to get some rest if you can." Hannah nodded, though her expression suggested sleep would be elusive. "I'm sorry about our wedding," she said softly. "Don't be," Matthew replied, drawing her into his arms. "Your brother needs you. The wedding will happen when it's meant to happen." He kissed her gently, then more deeply, trying to convey all his love and support in the embrace. When they finally parted, Hannah's eyes were damp, but her expression had steadied. "I love you, Matthew Reed," she whispered. "And I love you, Hannah Evans," he returned. Soon to be Hannah Reed, even if it takes a little longer than we planned. The journey to Junction City the next day was tense and quiet. Hannah, pale with worry and lack of sleep, seemed to retreat into herself as they rode. Matthew respected her need for silence, offering quiet support through his presence and occasional squeeze of her hand. They reached the train station with an hour to spare. After purchasing Hannah's ticket, a considerable expense that would take her all the way to Chicago, from where she could catch a local train to her hometown, they sat side by side on a bench, watching the bustle of the station. "I'll write as soon as I arrive," Hannah promised. "And again when I know more about Henry's condition." "I'll be waiting for your letters," Matthew assured her, "and I'll keep everything in order here. Don't worry about the school or our plans, just focus on your brother." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder. "I don't know how long I'll need to stay." "As long as necessary," Matthew said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere, Hannah. I'll be here when you return, whether that's in 2 weeks or 2 months." The train arrived in a cloud of steam and clanging bells. Matthew carried Hannah's trunk to the porter and saw it safely loaded, then turned to her for a final goodbye. "Take care of yourself," he said, holding her close. "And remember that you have someone waiting for you to come home." "Home," Hannah repeated, touching his face tenderly. "That's what you are to me now, Matthew, no matter where I am." With a final kiss, she boarded the train. Matthew stood on the platform, watching until the train disappeared into the distance, carrying his heart with it. The days following Hannah's departure were among the longest of Matthew's life. He threw himself into work finishing the house renovations, preparing for the fall cattle drive, helping with the town's ongoing recovery projects. But every evening found him alone on the porch, watching the road that would eventually bring Hannah back to him. Her first letter arrived 10 days after she left, forwarded from Junction City to Cottonwood Springs. "Dearest Matthew, I have arrived safely in Millbrook and found Henry in better condition than I feared, but worse than I hoped. The fire destroyed our barn and damaged part of the house. Henry suffered burns to his hands and arms while rescuing the livestock, and a falling beam broke his leg in 2 places. The doctor says he will recover, but it will take time. His hands particularly concern me. They are heavily bandaged, and he cannot use them for even the simplest tasks. I am helping him and overseeing repairs to the property. Our neighbor, Mr. Daniels, has been kind enough to lend his sons to help with the harvest, but there is much to be done before winter sets in. Henry has no wife or children, so the responsibility falls to me as his only family. I miss you terribly. Each night I fall asleep thinking of the ranch, of the schoolhouse, of your face in the lantern light during our last dance. Please write to me at the address below. Your letters will be a lifeline connecting me to the future we still plan to share. All my love." Hannah. Matthew read and reread the letter until he nearly knew it by heart. That evening, he sat at his father's desk and wrote a lengthy reply describing the progress on the house, news from town, and his unwavering devotion to her. More letters followed, exchanged weekly as autumn deepened. Hannah reported Henry's slow improvement but ongoing need for assistance. The farm required considerable repairs before winter, and she couldn't in good conscience leave her brother until arrangements were made for his care during recovery. In Cottonwood Springs, life continued. School resumed with Mrs. Powell as temporary teacher. The final bridge repairs were completed. The first snow dusted the mountains in late October, a reminder that winter approached. Matthew maintained the ranch and their future home with meticulous care, but the empty rooms echoed with absence. Each letter from Hannah brought both joy and frustration: joy at her words of love and reassurance that she would return, frustration at the ongoing delays keeping them apart. In early November, nearly 2 months after Hannah's departure, Matthew received a letter that made his heart sink. "My dearest Matthew, winter has arrived early here with heavy snow already blanketing the fields. Henry continues to improve, but slowly. The burns on his hands are healing, but he still cannot manage buttons or writing, much less farm work. His broken leg mends, but he remains largely confined to the house. I have inquired about hiring help, but with winter setting in, few are willing to take on a position that requires living in our damaged home. The repairs proceed, but more slowly than hoped due to the weather. What I am trying to say, my love, is that I cannot in good conscience leave Henry before spring. He has no one else, and as much as it breaks my heart to be separated from you, I cannot abandon my only brother in his time of need. I understand completely if this changes your feelings or intentions. Our separation has already extended far beyond what either of us anticipated, and asking you to wait several more months seems terribly unfair. If you wish to release me from our engagement, I will understand, though it would shatter my heart to lose you. Please know that I love you and think of you constantly. The ring you placed on my finger remains there, a daily reminder of the future I still hope we might share. With all my love and deepest regret." Hannah Matthew read the letter twice, then set it down on the table and walked outside into the cold November air. The mountains stood stark against the twilight sky, already wearing their winter blanket of snow. The ranch spread before him, ready for the winter ahead. The barns stocked with hay, the cattle moved to the sheltered southern pastures, the house addition complete and waiting for Hannah. As he stood there, Matthew came to a decision. He could not wait passively for spring to bring Hannah back to him. There had to be another solution, and he intended to find it. The next morning, he rode into town before dawn and sent a telegram to Hannah. "Received your letter. Stop. Do not give up on US. Stop. Have planned. Stop. Will write immediately. Stop. All my love, Matthew." Then he visited Sheriff Hollister, Mayor Whitley, and Reverend Powell in succession, explaining his intentions and seeking their advice and support. By noon, he was riding hard for Junction City, a letter in his pocket and determination in his heart. 3 days later, Hannah was sitting at her brother's kitchen table, helping him with his breakfast, when a knock came at the door. Frowning, they rarely had visitors. Especially in the early morning, she went to answer it, pulling her shawl tighter against the November chill. When she opened the door, she nearly collapsed in shock. There on the porch, his hat in his hands and snowflakes melting on his shoulders, stood Matthew Reed. "Matthew," she gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. How may I come in?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion but his eyes bright with purpose. "It's quite cold out here." Still stunned, Hannah stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat on a peg by the door, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had traveled 1,000 miles to arrive exactly where he needed to be. "Who is it, Hannah?" "Called Henry from the kitchen." "It's," Hannah began, but her voice failed her. "Matthew Reed, sir," Matthew called back, offering his hand to Hannah, who took it automatically. "I've come a long way to meet you." They entered the kitchen together, where Henry Evans sat at the table, his bandaged hands resting before him and his splinted leg propped on a nearby chair. He looked up at Matthew with evident surprise and curiosity. "So you're the cowboy who stole my sister's heart," Henry observed, his eyes moving from Matthew to Hannah and back again. "She's told me a great deal about you in her letters." "All good things, I hope," Matthew replied, pulling out a chair for Hannah before seating himself. "Mostly," Henry said with a small smile, "though she mentioned you're stubborn as a mule. Your appearance on my doorstep seems to confirm it." "Matthew," Hannah finally found her voice. "Why are you here? How did you get here?" "Trained to Chicago, then hired a wagon to bring me the rest of the way," Matthew explained simply. "As for why..." He reached into his pocket and withdrew her letter. This is why. I couldn't wait until spring, Hannah, not when there might be another solution. Henry's eyebrows rose. Another solution? Matthew turned to address him directly. Mr. Evans, I love your sister. We were to be married in September before your accident called her home. Now she feels torn between her duty to you and her promise to me. I would never ask her to choose, Henry protested. Nor would I, Matthew assured him. Which is why I'm here with a proposal for both of you. Hannah and Henry exchanged confused glances. What kind of proposal? Hannah asked. Matthew took a deep breath. I want you both to come back to Cottonwood Springs with me. Henry shook his head. This is our family farm. I can't abandon it. I'm not asking you to abandon it, Matthew clarified. I'm suggesting you lease it at least until you're fully recovered. The Reed Ranch has plenty of room for all of us. You'd have time to heal properly with Hannah nearby but not solely responsible for your care. And the farm? Henry asked skeptically. I took the liberty of inquiring at the bank in town yesterday, Matthew said. They know of a family looking to lease farmland, the Petersons, with 4 grown sons. They'd work the land through next harvest with a portion of the proceeds coming to you. Hannah stared at Matthew in amazement. You've thought of everything? Not quite everything, Matthew admitted. There's still the matter of getting you both to Cottonwood Springs before the mountain passes close for winter. The station master says we have perhaps 2 weeks before heavy snow makes the journey difficult. 2 weeks, Henry echoed. To decide the fate of our family farm and move halfway across the country. I know it's sudden, Matthew acknowledged, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of time. He reached across the table to take Hannah's hand. I've learned that you have to seize happiness when it's offered or risk losing it forever. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. You came all this way. I would have gone twice as far, Matthew said simply. Henry looked between them, then down at his bandaged hands. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent save for the crackling of the fire in the stove. The house needs a new roof before winter, Henry said finally, and someone should check that the Petersons know how to properly rotate the north field crops. Hannah's head snapped up. Henry. Are you saying? I'm saying your Cowboy makes a compelling case, Henry replied with a hint of a smile, and that perhaps it's time for the Evans family to consider new horizons. He fixed Matthew with a serious look. But I want your word that if I agree to this, you'll make my sister happy. You have it, Matthew promised solemnly, for as long as I live. 2 weeks later, a train pulled into Junction City carrying 3 passengers from the east: Hannah Evans, her brother Henry, and enough trunks and crates to start a new life in the west. Matthew was waiting on the platform with a wagon specially outfitted with cushions and blankets to make Henry's journey to Cottonwood Springs as comfortable as possible. The town welcomed them with open arms, having been prepared by Matthew for their arrival. Doc Wilson immediately took charge of Henry's medical care, declaring that the journey hadn't set back his healing and might even have done him good. Mrs. Powell gracefully stepped aside, returning the schoolhouse and teaching duties to Hannah while keeping the lending library she had expanded in her absence. Matthew and Hannah were married 3 days after their arrival, in a simple ceremony at the church. Henry, supported by crutches, proudly gave his sister away. The entire town attended, celebrating not just the union of 2 beloved community members, but the triumph of love over distance and adversity. That evening, Matthew brought his bride home to the ranch, to the house he had expanded and prepared for their life together. As they stood on the porch in the gathering dusk, he swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he murmured against her hair. Hannah wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes shining with happiness. "It feels like I've been on a very long journey to reach this moment." "Worth every mile," Matthew assured her as he set her gently on her feet in the front hallway. He led her through the house, showing her the improvements he had made in her absence: the expanded kitchen with its new cast iron stove, the dining room large enough for family gatherings, the cozy sitting room with bookshelves built especially for her collection. Upstairs, he hesitated outside the door to what would be their bedroom. There's one more room I want to show you, he said, leading her instead to a smaller room at the end of the hall. When he opened the door, Hannah gasped. The room was painted a soft yellow, with white curtains framing the window that looked out over the mountains. A rocking chair sat in one corner, and the walls were adorned with shelves holding children's books and small wooden toys. "Matthew," Hannah whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the rocking chair. "Is this?" "For our future," he confirmed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "For the family we'll build together. I wanted you to know that I've been thinking of all of it, not just our wedding, but our life beyond." Hannah turned in his embrace, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "I love you, Matthew Reed." "And I love you, Hannah Reed," he replied, lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that sealed their journey from strangers by a flooded river to partners in a shared future filled with promise. In the years that followed, the ranch flourished under their care. Henry eventually recovered enough to establish his own small horse breeding operation on the ranch, becoming an integral part of their extended family. The house that Samuel Reed had built, that Matthew had expanded, became known throughout the valley for its warmth and hospitality. And on spring afternoons, when the river ran high with melted snow, Matthew would sometimes stand on the bank with Hannah beside him, watching the water flow past the new fence line he had built the summer after their wedding. "Do you ever think about that day?" Hannah would ask, knowing he did. "Every day," Matthew would reply, his arm around her waist, perhaps with a child or two playing nearby. "Every single day." For while the river had taken his father's fence, it had given him something far more valuable in return: the woman who taught him that the most important legacies aren't built of wood and nails, but of love and memory, passed down through generations like the most precious inheritance of all.